Okay, welcome. I think we are here live here in this cold January, waiting for another winter storm. So, um, again, this time of the year is often sort of a time for deep in the ground visioning, hibernating, healing, doing deep inner work. And so, I want to just share a little bit about how I understand this work and the kind of inner journey that is involved. Um, but I also want to tie in, recently we celebrated Martin Luther King Day, a great man who called us to this vision of a beloved community. And I want to just read the definition of this because I think it helps to see this in a concise way that the beloved community is a vision, and it was popularized by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It's a vision of a global society built on love, justice, and equality, where poverty, racism, and conflict are resolved peacefully through nonviolence, creating a world of interconnectedness and shared well being achieved through collective commitment to human dignity and reconciliation. So, given where we are in our world today, this is like, it seems like it's further away than ever it was before. And it certainly, was a long ways away in the time that Dr. King, brought this forth. There's a lot of the seeds of this, what's happening today, that were sowed in these times of the 60s. And so, we have this other powerful, let's see, somehow I just completely disappeared something. Hold on. This is so interesting. Like, my ADHD, I can't ever find what I'm looking for on here, and anything like this that happens is kind of loses me completely. But I think I'm back. So let's try this again. And what did I lose my Zoom? There it is. Okay. All right, I think I'm back. So we have, another powerful man, in today's day that's turning all of this, sort of my whole lifelong understanding of convention and world order and, politics and everything sort of upside down. And it's sort of like a might makes right approach that, uh, makes sense given where we are, with the shrinking world. And, it almost seems to call forth this kind of, way of looking rather than a cooperative approach, a competitive approach. And what matters is winning at all costs. And so, here the strong win and dominate the weak, and they control the weak resources. And that's, kind of this global thing that's happening right now. So the entire system of life is really put in slavery to this dominator mindset, and this take all and, winning kind of thing, which is really this opposite vision, I think, of what Dr. King had in mind. So, however we want to look at it, this time that we've been in on Earth seems to be ending, and I don't think we're going back to this old thing, but I think it is an opportunity maybe to actually move forward. And maybe, I mean, the more I look into it, the more I think that the outer calm and peace and, convention was really sort of kind of a mask, and that there were, many things going on behind the scenes that were also more of this dominator type program. So I don't think that that program is ever going to work, and really is sort of the dying song of this old order, whether it was hidden, as I think it was for most of my life, more underground, or is kind of like out in the open, totally, as sort of the new norm of things, and okay, crawls out of the shadows. But it's also revealing what had been hidden. And I think it's going to ultimately dismantle and collapse the superstructures that hold it in place now. And so it's going to be kind of a new beginning for like everything in some ways, and an opportunity maybe to reset and go forward. Now, of course, we have to go beyond this moment of conflict and competition at its height. So I don't know exactly how we're going to get there, but I do think that, it's through life experience that we grow, that we learn, that we see the results of the choices we've made, that we maybe consider new directions and new ways of going forward. So, and I also believe in a way that each person is playing a great role in this cosmic play, and that we're all here in a way to transition, and to bring about the end of the current era and bring us into a new future. But what that future will be is still shaping up, and it requires that each of us do our part and live our lives sort of from the inside out. Each choice that we make is going to affect the collective, and is also going to set a tone and a truth that we're going to align in and hold within ourselves. And it's kind of like by our simple choice, I think, there's a way that what could be dark and destructive maybe becomes a new type of beginning. Out of the ashes the phoenix arises, that kind of thing. So it's like each one of our lives really is a part of this grand process that's happening. And each one of us, we choose to be here. Maybe we didn't realize that we chose it. We kind of just find ourselves here, and don't even know what it's about or what we're doing, and in some ways. But as we try to go on a journey to understand this and seek, what the purpose of our lives are, why we find ourselves where we find ourselves, what history is unfolding, all of these things I think are like a learning process, and to recognize that we each have a role in the choices to make about how we're gonna be in these times, and maybe make our way past them into something else. And I think a lot of people feel insignificant and helpless, and who knows what to do. We can go out and protest, or those kinds of things, but there is I think, a real sense of being a pawn and sort of being helpless against what is happening. And even the institutions that were put in place to create the checks and balances are collapsing or faltering. And so it's hard to discern for all of us, when to run, when to fight, when to walk away, or even how we can do any of it. But I believe that there is this new future, not ultimately in the hands of politicians or the corporations or all of the systems that seem to, be structuring our options. But it's really sort of something within each one of us. So, what is your vision? What do you feel called to serve? Can you articulate a longing in your own being, and a sense, even in, not the whole global community, but in your community at home? How do we find balance? How do we find nonviolence? How do we find this love and connectedness that, goes forward in mutuality, in a way that is a mystery in some sense, and is still waiting to be discovered, to be birthed. Um, we've improved, we've grown, we've gone back and forth, over time. We've had many, sort of movements of utopian possibilities, and mostly the result has been the opposite of that, where humanity continues to, you know, really take a big toll on the rest of the world and on anything that it believes is other. So, we're in this big transition, and so I thought I would talk about a little bit of my own journey, because I think there's a way in which I don't want to like set my life apart in any special way, but I think most people look at the journey that they're walking as through the lens of the ego, and so they don't really see their beauty, their possibility. They're just aware of where they fit in this world, and in this current world, sort of like, unless you're the greatest singer in the world or the greatest politician or the greatest, something or another, like you're kind of like the alpha level, and everything, everybody else is sort of not realizing their significance and their importance in terms of creating the new, and in terms of choosing what we really want. So I want to just talk a little bit about this understanding I have of the soul journey, and how each one of us came here with a mission and with a part to play in whatever timeline we're in. So, as a child, I felt this kind of powerful responsibility, and I felt sort of a premonition very young about this time that we're in now. And I was even aware that I would be an old lady when we arrived here, but it was, not really articulate. It was just a kind of general sense that, you know, again, in the 60s, there was a lot of sort of the opening of this process that we're in now. And I could sense it. And, in my journey, I was actually in my mother's womb while she was sunbathing in southern Utah at the beginning of the Cold War. And so I was like, we were both exposed downwind of the atomic test being conducted. I think my mother actually, had a lot of difficult health problems later on, and I wonder sometimes if there was an exposure. But so far, I'm good. And another interesting thing that I always have found when looking back at my journey, my story was, I was born exactly on the spring equinox, literally at 0 degrees Aries, which is the very, very beginning of this medicine wheel in the sky that we call the zodiac. And the way that I understand this force, this energy of Aries, of this kind of moment that I think I do carry a kind of dynamism within me that works with that, is that it's this force of new life breaks through stone. So we have to have this kind of strength and internally, to bring forth something new, because the concrete of the old, whether it's the stones on earth that the plants are, coming up through in spring. I mean, it seems like it's a delicate, tender, little shoot that arises, but the power that it has literally breaks through stone, and that's the life force. That's the ability to of evolution, of this continuous medicine wheel process of rebirth, of new beginnings, of you know the power of life in the midst of death to recreate itself. So I was sheltered in childhood in the beauty of nature. I was born in the canyonlands of Utah, and later lived in the Shoshone National Forest up in Wyoming, one of the largest wilderness areas in the United States. And And from a very young age, I felt, all of this, connection with nature, and also this kind of shaking underground, deep underground. And now it arises up and is literally shaking us, and we're all shaking. So, to share something about my journey from the perspective of a Western mystery tradition and sort of the alchemical processes of life. And again, not to make it something about me particularly, but to invite my listeners to actually begin to understand their own journeys in a larger way, in a larger context, in a more mythic context, in a, understanding that they are also, everybody here is on this, journey, this quest. And that quest is to sort of bring forth our gifts into life and to, encounter and conquer the demons and dragons that are in the way. Um, and of course, those are also within us in many situations. And maybe what we're seeing outside of us is somehow a mirror or a reflection, even as quantum physics is beginning to ask, and as many spiritual traditions talk about. It's like it's consciousness that is the creator. And so, if our consciousness is in fear or in competition or, you know, this kinds of states of feeling like, we have to be on top, we have to defeat the other, right? And there's a kind of numbness in the human soul that, can even take pleasure in that. And so there's this way in which we're, you know, seeing very clearly the two opposite possibilities in front of us, this beloved community, or, this conquest of might, uh, to, control resources. And, since there's no real respect for the life in any of those resources, I think it, doesn't bode well for the Earth community. Um, and yet, like I said, I think that in a way what we're seeing now is sort of the again, look closely and make your choice. There are two different paths here. And so one of the things that we can begin to understand is that each person here, we're really here, not like we would like to for a vacation. Oh, let's just have a simple good life, of abundant life, you know loving life. All of those things are wonderful and good, but it's like there's much more involved in here. We're really not here this time particularly, and I don't think Earth is ever meant to be really a vacation, right? The events that arise are here shaping us and molding us, and I think in some ways intentionally bringing out all of our old fears and defenses, and all of the old pseudo solutions to life's difficulties, to the difficulty of survival, to the difficulty of, being in relationship with other forces and each other and that kind of thing. So I think what we're seeing is really a part of this revelation, this great revealing, right? Which is actually what apocalypse and revelation means, right? It's showing us something that was hidden, something that we didn't know underground. And so we're, seeing what's really at certain levels of our being still alive within the human collective. And, this, temptation, right, to resolve our problems through conquest and through, uh, power over, and to just get rid of whatever we don't agree with or don't like, or all of that. So if we look at nature, this is not how nature survives. This is, there is competition in nature, but it's not this kind of competition. And in the bottom underground, level of everything is cooperation, is synergy, is co-creation. So, like maybe at the top level, within a species, there's competition, for mates or for food or something like that. But everything is connected with everything else and in balance through that connection. So if we're, ignoring this fact, or sort of fantasizing in some way, this is, Neptune is also here at 0 degrees Aries at this time, along with Saturn. And so Neptune is this dissolving of boundaries and, like a huge expansion, of, things that can also be sort of delusionary, right? And so power wants to expand in a delusionary way, right? and um, and then Saturn, of course, is limitation on structure, and they are actually, playing together in this kind of dance over this, these early degrees of Aries going forward now. Um, and so, it's like, again, these forces are, kind of reflecting these themes and what we're working with and what we're living with. And again, each one of us came in unique with a certain approach and a certain, gift maybe, or, a certain understanding or a certain, capacity that when we can let go of our defenses and our fears and our kind of, trying to protect something that I don't think can be protected and is probably a part of the process of, dissolving that we're in right now, that, we're here, like letting that dissolve in a way and seeing if a new structure, a new balancing, a new support. And we want to let dissolve any delusionary things, but we also want to, be more expanded and less boundaried in some ways, right? Seeing the interconnecting of all the life forces and the unitive place. And even, the understanding of the law of one, right? And of the teaching that we are all one. And we are learning this more and more through our scientific understanding now, um, not just even in humanity, but in, all of life and even all of the cosmos. So there's this interconnectivity, this communion, this cooperation that, can maybe bring the whole thing forward in a new way. But we're not there yet. And we're still sort of clearing, cleansing, revealing, facing into the darkness that we carry. And that, the tendencies are still, from this self protection and, fundamental, you know, what matters is me and nobody else does. Now, I think that we're really going to, possibly have an experience of grace. I mean, can you imagine a time if we all, somehow were expanded in consciousness? Many people have these experiences through meditation, through sacred plant medicine, through, breath work, through different things, where uh, people are realizing a deeper experience, a direct experience of the oneness. We all notice the synchronicities and the ways things are kind of operating in patterns and all of this. So, out of this sort of understanding, I think we can move forward in this mystery, right? Seeking these deeper connections and, how we can clear out the the places of harm, of hurt, negativity, and I think I lost my place a little bit. What I think I'm trying to say is that I think I don't see how humanity in our current state now can actually recognize what's happening and what we're doing to each other or to the earth. But I have some hope and faith that there are these instruments and even maybe uh, larger collective instruments, um, I remember back in the 60s, we used to fantasize about, putting LSD in everybody's water, it's like, and it wasn't malicious in a way, I mean, we wouldn't do it because it wouldn't be fair, it wouldn't be right. But in some ways, that's the dream. Like if everybody could have this full, direct, personal experience of the interconnection, of the oneness. If I would be, forced to feel the result of my cruelty on taken out on someone else, as if it were happening to me, that the cause and effect of, like the energy that I sent out boomerang back, and all of a sudden, I could feel the consequences of my unconscious choices and ways of behaving. And maybe also of the conscious ones that are tempted to think that I can gain somehow personally by taking, or hurting someone else. And so, this is a lie, a myth, a confusion. And yet, in the short term gain of things, it seems very compelling. And our survival is such a strong element, of our uh, apparatus here, our physical survival, is tantamount to anything. So, it has this kind of uh, orientation that is an us against them uh, process. And that's, in a sense, I think part of what's happening is sort of what we call our lower self, or the lower chakras, their survival, their pleasure, and their self-esteem, right? Um, these are individual kinds of aspects of who we are. And they do seem as if, it's like it's us, it's me against others, right? And it's a competitive world. And, if I'm going to make it, I have to, you know, put myself first. Then there's this, middle of our centers, the heart chakra. And in the awakening of that, we begin to open to this larger understanding of how it's all connected, and everything is happening for a purpose. And there's a kind of journey that we're all on. And it's a school, and it's a teaching, and it's a beautiful unfolding, and it's powerful, and it's immense, and it's intense, and it's tragic, and it's all kinds of things, right? But most of all, it's real, and it's this beauty, this beauty of creation. And we are small within that. And when we can sort of learn to trust in letting go of our me first kind of orientation, and sink back into the embrace of the collective, we discover another level of love and empowerment than we didn't know existed. And I think this is really the answer that we're seeking. But it does require us somehow to really understand and recognize more deeply this law of one. And so I'm not sure how it would happen, but there are channels and people saying that this is something that is coming, that there's a flash of light that is going to intensify and impact we're energy beings, right? And so it's going to expand our energy field. It's going to like kundalini, raise and awaken us, especially those who are ready, and even those who are less conscious, will probably have some experience, some direct teaching of the reality of the world, that's not in this competition or this self versus other, but it is in this larger truth of the loving collective. in the beloved community, which includes all of life. So I think we're in this transition now. And so I want to go back now and just talk a little bit about how, this each one of us is here. We came in, some part of us knew that we were entering into this kind of journey. The path work talks about how we remember this in between lifetimes, and we're involved in even creating and planning our journeys when we incarnate. Um, Not that we don't have free will and that choice can change, but we rehearse, we seek to understand, we try to guide ourselves in a way to our highest experience in each lifetime. And then, of course, the forces of the collective, of the temptations, of the fears and the physical suffering that is here on Earth, and the emotional suffering, right? Make that difficult to just like naturally, easily step into it. But it's in that quest and in that difficulty to do so that we really find our depth and our strength and our capacity. And so if we don't have anything to sort of come up against, nothing that resists us, then we have difficulty learning and growing. And so I think that each one of us really did plan to be here at this time, and you have a very unique personal mission, of transformation and education of your own soul. And you also came here with a gift, with more than one gift, with you know ways of serving the whole, serving others, serving even just your own children, your own family, is an amazing sacrifice and service. So it doesn't have to be grandiose. In fact, I think that in this new journey coming up, we're going to see that leaders will become like in the background more, and supporting the you know growth and movement of all people, so that there's not sort of this leadership sort of as a kind of dominant position, or a envied position, or a king of the mountain kind of thing. um, Leadership will take its place, I think, at the base of the triangle of the creation, of the pyramid now, because it is the support and the foundation. And then all people can rise and grow and develop in that sort of circumstance. And so, it's like the pathwork talks a lot about that, came in the 1950s, 57 through 78, and, kind of came in announcing that it was like reiterating the perennial understanding and philosophy of spirit, for these times, and that we were entering into these times of transformation, of vast evolutionary growth in humanity, and with it will come crises and struggles and that kind of thing. But the purpose of all of it is for our development. And one way to look at it is that this Earth sphere was really created by the state of consciousnesses that inhabit it. So in the last period of time, I think humanity as a whole was in a stage of individuation, where the individual, like to become truly co-creative, we can't just be slaves to an outer force. We each have to become fully ourselves, fully own our gifts, fully, individuate, and not be codependent, not needing others to, be full, be ourselves, be whole. And so, our journey in that, was kind of up against the collective forces, and still is. So we're still in that process, and yet as we leave that, as we've established that to some degree, that state of individuation can become, just totally self-centered and separated from others and from nature. And it sees everything other than self as just something to use or discard. So, like the development of the self was important and necessary for the next phase to happen. But this next phase is something that is taking the self beyond itself and back into this larger understanding of the greater self, of this collective self, of this beloved community of life that, is like we can be a part of the co-creation and the birthing of that. And to do that, everything that's out of balance is, shaking and may fall down, but that is the way to ultimately bring things back into balance. And so, like I said, I've heard prophecies of this event that is going to break through our walls of separation. That's kind of almost like, I would say, a spiritual grace, like a miracle, but these have happened in Earth, and maybe it's really, as we understand more and more of quantum physics, we will understand, it's not so much, out of the bounds of possibility, but is, again, nature guiding us, this larger totality of life that is giving birth to the human more and more fully, and I think the human is like the caterpillar that's transforming into the butterfly on this collective level. And, like the caterpillar is a very, very different creature than the butterfly. And I think I've said before, we may not actually recall much about, what this past was like. Maybe we remember it all, but in some ways we will truly be different kinds of beings at the other side of this. And, so we want to realize that this oneness that we're in, is real. And I think how we will do that is we will begin to, in various ways perhaps, expand our psychic senses, our, like the physical senses, individuate us and keep us in a situation of experienced separation. I can feel me to the edge of my skin, sometimes I can intuit or sense maybe something beyond that. But, it's like there seems to be a me and a not me. And I think that is a bit of an illusion. That could be a spell that we're under that is lifted or is broken in some way, so that humanity as a whole actually recognizes something more of what's happening, what's going on. And this evolutionary moment, is not the end of us, but the beginning of a new experience of humanity on Earth. So each one is here and choosing, and some of us will continue on the old karmic path because that's right for our soul journey. But there are many here now as witnesses that will become awakened way showers in these next few years to, give birth hopefully to a new beautiful stability, spiritualized stability, uh, structure grounded in, the beautiful spiritual expansion of Neptunian kinds of energies, and a new beginning here that will allow that law of one to become realized in a different way. And so now is really the time to see, who every one of us is really, uh, and what gifts we're preparing to, launch into this new time frame. And also we're here kind of in the final mop up to clear the negative habits and patterns that we brought that, we're here to transform, and they don't support us. And so like sometimes these times of intensified, transgression or whatever, triggers even greater defense and our own hatred, and negativity. And so, it's like it's all kind of, I think, here for us to see, mostly take responsibility for the forces in us that still are tempted into hatred and into, our own desire to hurt back into, what we understand as, the lower self and the defenses of the ego personality. And as we clear that, as we face that, we feel that, we recognize that, we take responsibility for that, we clear that. And so a lot of what's happening now, I think, is really designed, to shake us, to bring up our fears, to bring up our doubts, to bring up our, rage and outrage and, all of these feelings. But it's like, it feels tempting to just, yeah, let's, join the fray and act them out and, uh, you know, try to win with might over right. But in some level, I think what we're all being asked to do is recognize these and acknowledge them. It's like we're not trying to get rid of anything in us. It's always a process of integration. But in that process, they will settle and they will find a higher expression within us. And I think that's already within us and built in. So our job is mostly just to challenge, just to question, just to hold in love, but to seek higher possibility within each of us, to invite our own higher self to come and uh, guide us, inspire us, help us find a different way than the one that we're so familiar with, which just continually kind of recycles itself in conflict and violence. So I want to again go back to sort of my journey and, to share a little bit about, sort of a way in which everybody here, right, brought in stuff that they, were clearing, and really, moving out of, their inner dynamic for this time period so that they could fully embody this transformation. Um, and and yet, we're also here, like believing that we are limited, believing that, we are these versions of ourselves that maybe didn't have great success. We're not the millionaires. We're not the movers and shakers. We're, struggling just to find our way. And, we think that somehow then that's not a significant life, a life, that seems more broken than whole, all of that. And so we give up on ourselves, or we, feel in comparison that we're, you know, nothing, or we're not good enough, or we can't perform what we came here to do. So, in a way, I'm just, saying, take a deeper dive into your life journey. I used to teach a Dying into Life program at Seven Oaks, a residential program over the course of a year that, actually began with, a life review in a sense, right? Which is often something we do after we die, according to the teachings. But it's very, very useful to, kind of expand our perspective and to revisit the journey of our life uh, from those more mythic perspective, from the lens of, oh, I came here to work on my stuff and bring this gift, and I have a mission, and I have, a purpose, and I came in these really trying and difficult or powerful times, maybe for others they're wonderful, but, it's like it's a strong time, right? And so we can really begin to honor this unique life, even though it's not our only life, it's a unique life experience. And, it's kind of a culmination. I mean, it's almost like where we are here now in the world is all the timelines that I can remember, and more are all awake and alive at the same time, right? We have, reiterations of all of the philosophies and teachings and stories and ideas and, you know, ways of competing on Earth that we've ever, ever, discovered. And it's like we're just here in this, chaos of all of these multiple timelines that, included competition and power over and the people that lost are still fighting to win and the people that win are still fighting to keep their advantage. And it's like, so we're here really trying to discover within ourselves something else, a new way forward, a different way of journeying, and a different story altogether. And many of us, I think, like me, have been working on that journey and that story from a long, from a ways back. Because, like I said, this is a process. It's not an overnight thing. It's been happening for the last 75 years now, and maybe longer. It's like it's an ongoing process of the journey. But I think we're coming to a conclusion, to a head, to a seminal time of this process. So we're here, to clear the negative habits and patterns that don't support us. It's like this life review can be a beautiful way of recontextualizing and understanding, and bringing into this moment a sense of what is your rebirth, what is your renewal. Um, And, what did you come in with? And what have you completed? What have you resolved? And what's still left? And what happened in your wounding? And how did, you learn to hide or deny yourself to, get along, to go along, and not fully become yourself, right? What gifts are there still hiding within you, longing for development? What calls us? What do we love? Love in a natural way, that's what's important, to follow that, and to, then whatever we encounter that blocks that or that makes that difficult, to dissolve that, this Neptunian force of dissolution of the old structure of the blocks, but then, yeah, there's a new structure waiting to be invited in. And it's something of our own creation, and it's maybe a different kind of structure than we've ever known, trying to superimpose structure. Maybe it's a structure that comes up from within, like the structure of the tree, grows and adapts to the forces outside, that kind of thing. So here's a little bit about my journey, and how, as I went through this, I began to you know understand some of this and the struggles I had and all of that. Not again as a way to set me apart or anything like that, but to provide it as an example of how to contextualize your own journey a little bit, to not just tell it from sort of the matrix viewpoint, whether your successes or your failures, like your wins and your losses, your accomplishments or your lack of accomplishments. It's like that black and white way of looking at, our, we made it or we didn't, we're good or we're not, it's like, and when we're not, we feel less than, and we feel shame, and we feel, and that doesn't serve, because there's nothing in us ever that we should be ashamed of. It's all part of the universe that, we brought here to either develop or to heal and transform, right? And so, again, it's not even who we are, right? Which is a big confusion. Okay, so back to my story. Let's see if we can follow it a little bit. So, from a young age, I did have a sense that life was a deep mystery school, and that I was on a journey and I had a mission or a calling, but I had no clue what it was, and it made no sense to me, and I had no idea of how to answer it. And so, in part, that I became a seeker for many years, and a part of that was out of all of the difficulties that I faced. It's like if I was supposed to, you know, be able to do something right, like I was terrible at it. And especially as a child, we have our dreams and we have our play, and we imagine that we're going to be the heroes in the story, right? And yet, life may oftentimes confront us with other situations, and kind of causes us to deny or lose faith in these deeper inner, impressions and callings that we have within ourselves. And we have to kind of figure out how to go along and get along, and how to adapt in some way. And so, in some sense, I think we all lose our early light, right? And kind of just entering into the world of incarnation and the development of the mind, and rational consciousness, and the school and educational process we have in our culture. um, it it really starts to seat us in a certain way of being, and limits a lot of other possibilities. And so, on top of that, you may have had real trauma to deal with, like difficulty in the family relationships, or difficulty in, political circumstances, or economic circumstances, or whatever, that, were deeply, deeply challenging, even just for survival. And certainly, the sense of self, the light of, the child that came, to make a difference, to, create something new, begins to doubt itself, begins to not know how to go forward. Complexities and difficulties seem insurmountable. And, many people have very, very much more difficult lives than I did. I'm always amazed in the work that I do, to hear the stories, and the difficulties that children face as they seek to find their purchase in life and bring their gifts into the world. I was lucky. I had good and conscientious parents, and even though they were imperfect and human, they weren't consciously cruel or egocentric. There was real love there, and I recognized it, and I was one of the lucky ones. But even this didn't save me from my destiny and from my wounds. Wherever my limitations came from, they created a set of challenges, and then perhaps those led me further into the underworld, as, I felt bad about myself, and also rebellious for always being in trouble. And so I wanted to be the heroine, but I really, seemed to be a kind of scapegoat in my experience. And then my father was a wildlife biologist, and he took a job with the Forest Service when I was in first grade, and we moved from Utah to Cody, Wyoming. And I always loved nature, and we were outdoors a lot in Utah, as well as a wildlife biologist for the state of Utah. But as we, went up to Wyoming, this place, we got to spend, I was older, we spent more time in nature, camping, horsepacking into the Wyoming wilderness. And so it was kind of here that my deep mystical understanding of nature was born. And my father also, carried this deep reverence, as well as my mother. She loved to be outdoors. So, I was in the Garden of Eden. And, Wyoming, the population was very, very small at that time, and so there was, many places that human beings had never even set foot, that I had the privilege of walking in the deep mystery of nature. And yet, even here, in this small western town, um, there was a snake in the garden. And at a very, very young age of 7, I had sort of my Me Too moment with a guitar teacher pedophile. And, this was deep in that heartland of America in the, 50s, and, a small Western community. So if it was there, I know it was widespread and everywhere. And it was through that experience, which I don't remember even now, and I lost my memory even that it had happened, um, for many years, although sort of the outcome seemed to indicate that there might have been something like that, um, as my, you know, emotional difficulties seemed to meet a broad, kind of spectrum of acting out that was created oftentimes through, sexualizing things very early. So, it wasn't the direct memory, it wasn't anything like that, and at first, I know this because a friend of mine recollected it to me, that I didn't tell anyone. It's like, again, the loving nature of the child. It's like I didn't want to get him into trouble. I knew somehow that there was, something loving. He wasn't, I don't think, cruel or anything like that, but it was, again, way beyond what a 7-year-old is supposed to understand and handle. And so finally, I understand that I did, speak out about it. But according to my mother, she didn't believe me. And again, it's not beyond the pale to see that this was an innocent thing, because in 1958, this was not something that people were much aware of. It was kind of incredulous. And yet, still, this lack of belief, I think, was more the difficulty that I encountered ultimately, because it kind of created an alienation from the family. And then later on, deeper and deeper alienation from myself. So both the experience and the not being believed set up this deeper dive, right? Again, my understanding is we incarnate, and in a way we are, in the incarnation, descending into an underworld. And then there is an actual descent that happens some point in life. And oftentimes when children are the ones that are taking this path of descent early on, that it's evidence really of part of this mission, of this soul journey, of this kind of shamanic initiation process that the child is undergoing. And it doesn't make it, I mean, in our culture we don't understand this. We just think, something's wrong. So there's again, the child experiences their experience as something's wrong with me. And that, I think, again, deepens this self-alienation. So, I believe in a way that, this was maybe something that my soul even chose, because in that journey, in that, being pushed off the cliff into the underworld, and then, trying to find my way, is a long one. And yet, looking back now, I see, all of what it brought me. And I also see, like the depths of, difficulty that it took me into. So by adolescence, I was one of the first people that I knew of, that, and we didn't even have a name for it at that time, that I had gotten an eating disorder. And this was, actually turned out again to be an amazingly instructive kind of inner psychological response to something within me that I didn't understand. Um, but it was very, very debilitating at the time. And so, like, by the time I'm going into early adolescence, I'm working with depression, clinical depression, bulimia, and I became pretty sexualized pretty early, like trying to find my life force, right? Um, and again, it was another journey into, like, okay, let me try to manipulate you, and then being manipulated instead, right? So, um, but it was the 60s, and it was a perfect time, it was like the end of the and sort of the sexual liberation was here, the pill was invented, right? And so, I was I've always been, a part of this larger cultural movement that's happening in the world. And so, it was also the 60s where I started using cannabis, and I had experience with the entheogen LSD and a few others, but LSD was probably the one that I used more than anything. And again, in hindsight, like the culture would say, oh, those were all problematic, but through my lens, like they were actually healing and helpful, and maybe also had some more problematic sides. I'm sure the cannabis didn't help the bulimia, as the munchies and all of that. But then there's this kind of deeper thing that I discovered about that way of processing things that I couldn't control and I didn't understand at the time at all, and it was completely humiliating. And it was a great instruction about how the limits of our self-will, like, oh, I'm going to control this, like an addiction. It's not controlled by the outer will. And so, and then many years later, when I actually became involved in ayahuasca path, that I discovered that this kind of bulimic process had roots, I think, even deeper in sort of a kind of, we all have different gifts, right, and different sensitivities and different capacities, superpowers, whatever. And so I didn't realize it back then, but once I discovered and began to understand something in the ayahuasca ceremonies, which are known for, purging, right? That there's this part of the practice that they actually call getting well, in which when we take the sacrament, we get nauseous and we throw up. And I think having encountered this process and through it recognizing what they say, what they would say, like, okay, one of my gifts is I'm a transport medium. I am sensitive and my system picks up energies from other people. Now, when I'm conscious of this and using it in a, way of service, I can help people with it. But when I didn't understand what it was, and yet unconsciously was still sort of pulling in other people's energies, then what would happen, like in the early journey with ayahuasca, is that I would clear those energies by throwing up. And I don't know if this has ever been, discussed, in other therapeutic situations with this thing called bulimia. But I think it would be useful, and certainly it helped me understand, and again, see myself in a different light. It's not that there's something wrong with me, that I should be able to control and can't control that, you know. This is something that is actually teaching me in a culture that knows nothing about mediumship to understand and clear myself of energies that would not have been good to let them stay within me. And so it's like, again, in this larger context, there's this kind of egoic story that the world, gives us of success, failure, of, we found our career, we make a lot of money, we found our mate, we, have a happy family. All of these kinds of things are just kind of aspects of, like this journey that we're on. And it has a much bigger understanding and context than sort of the superficial way of looking at it that we often are sort of just trapped in our world. And many people, I think, now are actually wondering, there must be something more to life, or what else is there, or how can we, even find our way through the current, chaos and shaking. So, all of this is, I think, in my life, was part of the way that I got myself lost and then found myself again. So that becomes the foundation, really, for being a wounded healer, being in service for these times. And I mean, not everybody came in to be that kind of thing, right? But we all came in with our gifts and with our challenges. And the challenges, I think, were actually aligned with and helping us to uncover and understand our gifts. So, if we can look at our lives from a bit of a mythic perspective, and see it as a soul journey, and see this, yourself as this soul who chose somehow to come in at this time and chose the parents and the circumstances in which it would be, influenced and affected, in early life, and plan to be here for these times of shaking and transformation. And, you have your own personal journey of learning and expansion and understanding, but, you also came to learn at a deeper level, I believe, this law of one, and this way that by, there's no greater pleasure in life that we can have than by serving the whole, by serving the collective in some way, you know, and that gives the life of consequence. And usually, our service is in some area where we are really interested, we enjoy it, and we love it, right? and and so when we can understand that we came here to, find that, and even if we haven't found it yet, it's even if you're, on the other side of your half life or whatever, it's like we are entering new times, and people are coming to this new moment at all stages and ages of life. And I believe that everyone will, have their own unique way of finding themselves and finding their way through this ending and this clearing. And so trust whatever it is that you're uh, planning on, that you're encountering, right? That you are intuitively, guided towards or longing for, and and then even if that doesn't work out, or the difficulties that come with that, trust in them. They're all, wonderful ways of continuing to develop your soul to fulfill its mission. And its greatest fulfillment is to live this life most fully as you intended to, expand, all your gifts and capacities, and to heal and clear all of the wounds. So there's a lot more to my story, but this may be a place to end for now. Um, and I want to thank everybody for joining me again. And, let me know if you want to explore your life from this perspective more. I can help, and there's different ways that I can introduce you to this potential understanding. I think that the best way is, to do individual sessions where you have the focus on, yeah, what's going on here? What is this in me? How does this fit with, my life mission? So if you have interest in what I'm sharing, please connect with me, and let's do a free exploratory session to see if this actually is useful for you. And you'll know if it's good, and then if so, we'll work it out, in some way for how you can continue to study and make a greater, self-discovery. And that will help you navigate these coming times, I think, with joy and deeper capacity. And the more that we have of us finding our way in that way, the more that we will find our way into a new expression of humanity on this planet, and hopefully an expression that understands this law of one, not only with your own brothers and sisters, but with all of life here. Okay, so happy to connect again. Hopefully, we'll see you again in a couple of weeks.